Hi everyone, I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks for joining us today for the Cold War Spaces series. Today I'd like to welcome our guest Julia Tatiana Bailey on the topic of exhibition space, art as diplomacy across the Cold War divide. She's an art historian and curator specializing in the visual culture of the Cold War and is currently the curator of modern and contemporary art at the National Gallery Prague. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Julia and Joes Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. So please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We also have the chat function open. So if you have any comments or would like to share something longer, you can put those comments in the chat function, and please make sure the blue button that says to, make sure it says all panelists and attendees, because it usually defaults just to the panelists. And so as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat and say what city you're tuning in from. And please keep your questions short and concise. We'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo page. So if you want to go back and share it or go back and view previous programs, you can do that there. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting our discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now Joes will get us started with the program.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. In 1959, the United States hosted the American National Exhibition in Moscow, part of a cultural exchange agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States. Abstract expressionist painters such as Jackson Pollock were among the artists selected for the art section. However, at home in the United States, conservative politicians such as Congressman George Dondero had fulminated against abstract expressionist art and other modern artwork as a communist plot to undermine and subvert American society, while one of his colleagues interpreted Pollock's signature drift paintings as decoded maps of the United States in preparation of a Soviet missile attack. Art in the context of the Cold War is a tremendously rich and at times very strange topic. Today we are going to discuss the use of art as a means of diplomacy or propaganda in traveling exhibitions during the Cold War. I'm very happy to be joined by Julia Tatiana Bailey, a true expert in the field. Julia, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Hello, thank you for having me today. This is really, I'm really glad to be part of this series because I've been watching the others in the series and such a great lineup of people. So great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's start by briefly looking at what happened just before the beginning of the Cold War. During the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union became allies in the war against the Third Reich. And for a small period of time, both countries produced movies celebrating each other. How, Julia, do you think, or do you know, did this work out in the field of fine arts? And what was the role of the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship in this story?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the countries had, you know, a very difficult relationship from the start of the Soviet Union or the Soviet project, when America or the United States is supporting the kind of white army in Russia, trying to get claim it back from the Red Army. So, you know, they had a very difficult relationship, and then yes, suddenly they find themselves in this alliance, and that had an effect on the art as well, because in the United States, the artists, the sort of left-wing artists, were being sidelined more and more in before the war, except then you've got the New Deal art project, so which is in response to the Great Depression. These artists are having a bit of a moment there, that they're getting some kind of public art projects. And then suddenly they're called on to represent the United States in terms of this alliance. And the Soviet Union, obviously, because it had socialist realism, which just a singular form of art or method of creating art that had been imposed since the 1930s, was much more prepared for this, because their art was inherently aimed to be didactic, so easily understandable to everyone, and educational. So anyway, I'll go on to the screen share and show you a few images which I think are quite interesting. This first one is Philip Evergood, who's an American artist, a left-wing American artist, and he's, like you say, he's connected to this group, the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship, which is founded in the middle of the war. And it's mainly gravitated towards it, cultural figures, and particularly artists, visual artists, who were left-wing, who were communist, or who were fellow travelers of some sort. Philip Evergood created this painting in relation to the Russian Relief Fund, which was running at that time and was closely associated to the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship. So this shows Joseph E. Davis, who's the first US ambassador, or maybe the second, but US ambassador to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, had a very close relationship with the Soviets, and his counterpart, Litvinov, are shown together here. So you have these images that are created at this time in the Cold War, that's really, in the Second World War, sorry, that's really celebrating this alliance between America and the US. And on the horse, it's actually Hitler, you can see, as the skeletal figure, and the other one's Mussolini. So this is a great painting. Another really interesting example is Anton Refregier's War and Peace mural. This is in the Rincon Annex, which is a former post office in San Francisco. And this is particularly interesting as it's the last of the New Deal art projects. So it's publicly funded, and it's celebrating, again, the Grand Alliance. It's got the Soviet flag there and the American flag side by side. And on the right-hand side, it's celebrating the foundation of the United Nations as well, again, with the Soviets and the Americans side by side. And
I would say, looking at the date, 1946 to 48, it's after the Second World War. So
yeah,
just before the start of the Cold War, around 1947, 48.
Yeah, so it's planned before, and then the Cold War the Second World War, pushes it back. So they're only able to start work on it afterwards. And then this ends up becoming hugely political in the 1950s and almost gets destroyed. But it's still there today if you seek it out in the basement.
Right. Thank you. So that was a relatively short period where both later Cold War enemies were in concord with each other. But then looking at the Cold War in mainstream art historical narratives, there's usually this distinction between, on the one hand, the modern tradition associated with freedom and democracy in the West versus the socialist realism associated with political propaganda in the Soviet bloc countries. But then, as mentioned, some very conservative American politicians actually interpreted this modern art as a communist infiltration. That seems like a very strange paradox. And how do you interpret this situation?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually, because George Dondero, who's sort of the Senator Joseph McCarthy of the sort of visual arts, he's a congressman from Michigan, and he sort of sees his way to make a name for himself is to kind of criticize the art, the visual arts and artists in the art world, and really goes to town with it. So from 1949, he's in Congress, he's accusing these artists of trying to undermine the United States, of being traitors. He's naming names, he's giving a lot of personal details about these artists and curators and various other people in the art world in Congress. What's quite interesting is he's getting his information from a group of conservative artists, actually mostly sculptors, who used to enjoy most of the public art commission. So they were producing, these big bronze statues, the sort of ones we're seeing knocked down within the last couple of months, a lot of those sort of artists. And then they're seeing their control over these public funds really taken away by the support for social realist artists during the New Deal, and then the rise of the abstract expressionists in the post-war period, and the institutional support they're getting, and the support particularly in terms of showing their art abroad. So when people talk about just abstract and versus realist, there's actually all these other factions going on as well. There's people that tried not to engage with the politics, and then there's other people that are, like these very conservative artists that are trying to scupper both sides. And one of the things Don Darrow said, he claimed that actually there were two forms of art that were being controlled by the Soviet Union. One, which was socialist realism, he said had been created to suppress and control the Soviet people, and one which he claimed was abstraction, which had been sent out abroad by Stalin to undermine Western cultural heritage, which and he had a lot of information, but obviously it was very kind of fake news style. It was all sort of warped to suit his agenda.
So what's new, also very interesting, I think, is that this war against modern art is returned. Well, of course you have it in the Third Reich, the Degenerate Art exhibition. Then you have it in the Soviet Union, where every form of modern art is described as bourgeois decadence. And then you have people like George Darrow, who actually come with exactly the same claim. So across the ideologies, it seems that everyone has the same problems with modern art.
Absolutely, and also on the other side, you do have examples like in fascist Spain, when Franco is supporting abstract art or more modernist art because he's trying to get support from the United States, and so sending out that art is a way to try and claim that he's very modern and progressive, despite being a dictatorship. So it's not as clear cut as people sometimes think.
No, it's interesting. Also, Mussolini, of course, in his early political years, supported Italian futurism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And vice versa. But let's talk a bit about what happened in the 1950s. So, in the United States, artworks were sent abroad and used. Would you say like a diplomatic tool or like propaganda?
Oh, well, it's a difficult line. I mean, it was propaganda essentially, but it's a form of diplomacy, soft power diplomacy. This was really the birth in the late 1940s, early 1950s. This is the birth of this idea of soft power, and under Truman's administration in the second half of the 1940s, he doesn't really get very far with trying to use this, but when Eisenhower comes in, because he's been real supporter of this, the importance of psychological warfare in the Second World War, so he recognizes it as a tool, so he's very supportive of using this kind of soft power, and he talks about the Soviets waging total war, and he said the Americans have to wage total peace and use everything in their arsenal and all parts of life in order to wage that total peace, which is really interesting. And
I wanted to ask, and why do you think it is that the visual arts were considered such an important part of this total war? Because art seems to be such a peaceful medium.
Yeah, well, I'll show you some images actually. I know you were going to kind of maybe mention this later on, which was about the Soviet exhibition of science, technology and culture that opens in Manhattan in New York in the summer of 1959. And on the other side, there's the American National Exhibition that opens in Moscow in the same summer. They're actually overlapping for a few weeks. And this is as part of a cultural exchange treaty that is signed in 1957. So this is again under Eisenhower, under Khrushchev. After Stalin dies, it enters a new period, and the Soviets and the Americans start working together, or supposedly coming together to kind of form more alliances. But in fact, they're using these channels to try and scupper each other and to cause dissent within the countries. So they both say that they're going to have these big cultural exchange exhibitions to kind of announce this treaty. And they both, you know, explicitly say they won't show propaganda, but it's very clear if you read the notes of what they're deciding, what works to show, that they're clearly looking at it as a propaganda opportunity and an opportunity to get people into this country to sort of find out where are the soft areas that they can push to try and kind of get the
Can I briefly interrupt you here?
Yeah.
Because I think this is a very important, very interesting point, propaganda. If you think of socialist realist art in the Soviet Union, you can think, okay, that is probably propaganda. But if you look at abstract expressionist art, how can it be propaganda when it is abstract and therefore doesn't have a clearly recognizable political message?
Yeah, well, this is what's interesting. So I'll show you some photos. This is, oh, well, this on the right-hand side. So it's the Expo 58, the Soviet Pavilion Expo 58 in Brussels on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, this is the entrance hall to the Soviet exhibition in New York in 1959. And I was just showing they had the same sculpture there. But this is some images from the Soviet exhibition. This is Nixon and Eisenhower went on a tour, and you can see him. Well, Nixon seemed to be fairly interested in the art, but Eisenhower was really taken with the art because he was a amateur landscape painter himself. So I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute, though. But this was on the American side. These are Soviet citizens that are seeing the American art. And what you can see here is really clearly that on the American side, it was all about showing the pluralism of art, so the diversity of art. So yes, kind of later on, there are more emphasis towards promoting abstraction as a counterpoint to socialist realism and dividing the view of art. That sort of starts in the kind of latter half of the 1950s, but alongside that, there's also this real focus on promoting how diverse American art is, how you can produce something like Grant Wood's Parson Weems Fable, which is also slightly tongue-in-cheek, kind of anti-establishment painting about the life of George Washington. You can see in the background also a couple of his African-American slaves in the background. So it's quite a political work. And then on the right-hand side, and you can see the Soviet citizens looking at it, is Jackson Pollock's Cathedral. And the Americans were very keen to say, look, you can do anything in the United States. You can create any sort of art because we're free. And you have the freedom to do these sort of things. So abstract art was seen to be free because they had the freedom to create non-political arts, to supposedly to do whatever they wanted. You know, there was no control. It wasn't like in the Soviet Union where there was only one form of art you could produce. But of course, you know, it's not that simple. You have the art market, you have patrons, you have access to display opportunities that are very much controlled by interested parties on both sides. So there's
propaganda exhibitions.
more to the story than just this black and white version. There's all this kind of, you know, all these different angles.
Right, very interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about the reception of these works in Moscow? Because I assume this must have been a kind of a shock for the Soviet public, who wasn't in contact with even their own early 20th century avant-garde works at this time. So how did they respond to these works? Yes,
it was interesting. I mean, the American guides said most of what you heard was ridicule. So people would laugh, they didn't really know what they were looking at, but they came in droves. They got about 3 times the sort of number of people they were expecting. It's estimated that over the 6-week period they got 1 million visitors, who passed through the galleries. So that makes it one of the most viewed exhibitions in history, alongside the degenerate art exhibitions in Germany in the 1930s. So, you know, these two sort of controversial exhibitions that were supposedly sort of, you seeing the sort of art you didn't want to, that they didn't want you to see, or they didn't want you to produce, was really powerful. I've included a couple of images here. The left-hand side is Reginald Marsh, and in the reviews that was very scandalous because the Soviets were notoriously prudish and they didn't really like to show too much flesh unless it was a new Soviet man and a new Soviet woman, you know, brandishing their sides or something. So in which case it was quite you know, quite erotic, the art in a form. But certainly these sort of, you know, all the bodies together, that was quite a shock to people. And then this work on the right-hand side by Andrew Wyeth, this was really popular with the people there. And what was quite interesting is this was also a work that was picked out by Eisenhower, as he said, he really enjoyed. So again, his interest, his appreciation of art was more in line with the Soviet public, and was more in line also with the American public, in who you know, weren't necessarily so aware or interested in abstract art at this time, even though it was gaining institutional support. These are two works as well that just in the last week of the exhibition, Khrushchev came to look around the American National Exhibition and went straight to the art exhibition, which had been much discussed, and there was lots of news about it, always very negative, because of course in the Soviet Union the state controlled all the media, so there was only one narrative, and the narrative was that that America had betrayed its cultural heritage by showing this terrible art, when, you know, there were great people from the 19th century who were producing, you know, realist art. Americans lost realist tradition that was being repressed. So,
so there was this discrepancy between the official responses, Khrushchev and the Soviet press, and the public that laughed on the one hand, but also showed up in incredible numbers.
Exactly. And these are two works. Khrushchev came and looked around and obviously insulted everything he saw, which was kind of his way in quite vulgar terms. So he claimed the work on the left-hand side, the John Marin, he said it was the equivalent of a little boy pissing on the floor. And he said the Gaston Lachaise on the right-hand side must have been made by a homosexual, because no one who liked women could have liked this art. So the Americans, I think, had hoped that they could keep him away from the exhibition, but you know, he came in the last week. But you know, again, that worked quite well to American audiences, because, you know, once again he was playing this sort of vulgar Soviet caricature, which the Americans really played up to at that time. So it made there was a bit more support for what the Americans had achieved in their exhibition.
So in the preparations of the exhibition in Moscow, the American National Exhibition, the United States Information Agency was directly involved. There's an ongoing discussion about the role of the CIA. Do you have any information about that?
Yes. Yes, I mean, the CIA, again, it's a very kind of confusing, complicated story. The CIA was certainly involved and interested in the power of art and culture and all sorts of parts of life, how it could be exploited to further their cause. And I was just looking earlier through, the CIA actually created this document called the Inventory of Cold War Weapons in 1951, and it covers everything, you know, including all parts, military and technology, and but it has a section on culture, and I was just wrote down what they said because it's so poetic. And the CIA writing is saying, culture, like religion, generally permeates the souls of those imbued with it to such an extent that it is one of the last elements of independence purged out of the individual man under a totalitarian regime. So this idea of culture permeating the soul, I think, is really interesting that they give it this much power when, you know, people talk about it as soft power. They, you know, think it's quite neutral, but it was really recognized by these upper echelons of politics and of the intelligence services as its power. So, you know, the CIA, through several fronts, they were funding certain exhibitions, they were funding certain initiatives, certainly. How much the people that were working there knew about it, I mean, that maybe there were rumors and stuff, but, you know, it wasn't really until the late 1960s that sort of started being revealed and talked about more openly. But yeah, certainly the USIA is very interesting as well, being founded in the 1950s. Again, this is part of Eisenhower's psychological warfare campaign. And because the State Department in the 1940s had tried to use art as this kind of form of propaganda, and they'd sent out this exhibition, Advancing American Art, in 1947, and it got shut down because of criticism about the political record of some of the artists involved. So it ended up with a kind of McCarthyist, right at the start of McCarthyism, a sort of McCarthyist shutdown. And so Truman didn't really support cultural initiatives after that, but then Eisenhower came and really kicked this all off again, created a new agency that was specifically kind of controlling those sort of initiatives. But it all had to be done often through front organizations. So for instance, MoMA's international program, which was certainly a form of a front organization. I don't know whether it was receiving CIA funds, but it was underwritten, or it was funded by the Rockefellers, who were also very involved with politics. And yes, and through that they were showing this art abroad and sending it out.
Yeah, although it was never uncontested, of course, because people like Don Dero kept loyal to their original criticism. Since it's almost 12:30, I want to ask you two final questions. And one is, what happened to these cultural exchange exhibitions after the 1960s or after the 1959 exchange exhibitions? Did the visual art still play a very important role, or did it change?
Yeah, I mean, on the Soviet side, certainly the Soviets keep having exhibitions of sort of left-wing American artists in the Soviet Union to try and create dissent. There's a certain amount of exhibitions. The USIA keeps doing exhibitions, which are all sort of cultural, so sciences as well, and all sorts of exhibitions within the Soviet sphere. But the politics changes when you get into the 60s. You know, there's the rise of the peace movement in the US, which muddies the waters in terms of it's not so clearly divided as it is during the McCarthyist period, where, you know, you were on one side or the other, and particularly with the response to the Vietnam War and the discomfort within the United States about that, it all changes the parameters a bit. So these sort of clear-cut exhibitions and these forms of propaganda just don't work so well.
No, I understand. Do you think that artwork nowadays should play a leading role in connecting people across borders and ideologies? What do you think? Would it still work nowadays, something like those exchange exhibitions?
I don't think, I think people are too cynical. I think technology has moved on, that you couldn't do those form of exhibitions. I mean, I know North Korea tries to send out some art exhibitions and does some sort of art propaganda now, but, you know, in terms of other countries who are more globalized, I don't think it would work in terms of those sort of state-funded exhibitions, but certainly in terms of art exhibitions or art as a way to kind of allow communication between people that can't find other forms of communication between different countries. that is certainly something that I believe can still work very well, and you still see in many forms nowadays. And a particularly interesting example has been recently in East Germany, in Dresden. There's been a lot of public discussion about the history of the GDR and the art of that period, and how it had been sort of removed from the art galleries there, and that's been able to be a really productive site of debate between these opposing parties in quite a kind of difficult moment when there's the rise of the far right again in East Germany around that period. So that's been a really interesting example of seeing how art has provided a forum for people to come in and actually have more civil and thought-provoking conversations that they're not maybe able to have in other settings. So art kind of facilitates those sort of engagements.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So let's go to the Q&A, and maybe we can return to speaker's view now.
Yes.
You can, yeah, perfect. And there are already quite some questions. Let me start by Henry Klein. He says the Czechoslovak ex libris society in communist Czechoslovakia may have provided a kind of sub-rosa political support of dissident and banned artists, for instance, Oldrich Kulhany, when other avenues of political expression were cut off to them. Please suggest others who might have been supported by the ex libris community. I don't know if this is too specific.
Yeah, I think that's too specific for me, and that's not sort of my specialism, so I'm afraid I don't know. So, I mean, I can certainly look into it and see what I can find. Yeah. But yes, I'm afraid I don't know too much about that.
That's okay, let's go to another question by Henry Klein. Please comment on how the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1938 might have been a death knell to figurative artists in general and socialist realism in particular.
Yeah, well, in terms of social realism in the United States, it was really damaging to their to left-wing artists. It was really damaging to them when there was the Soviet Nazi pact formed, because that really undermined obviously the reputation of the Soviet Union, and they'd been trying to bring the Soviets and the Americans closer together because they were interested in their art. They kind of thought this was a way to bring peace, to bring these two groups together. In terms of, I'm not sure I know of any, because it was so short-lived, really, the pact, and at the time, you know, both countries edging towards war or waging war in some form. So, I do know there was an example of that there had been an exhibition of Soviet art that had been shown in the United States. That was true. It was at the New York World's Fair. And then at the end of that, the Soviets formed a pact with the Nazis, so they couldn't take part in the second year of the World's Fair in 1940. And instead, the Soviets sent art exhibition off to Germany instead. Yeah. So there were.
And I think the Hitler-Stalin Pact also was a bit of a shock for many left-leaning artists and cultural figures in the United States. They really struggled with it. So, yeah. The next question is by Bruce Hollian. To what degree does a lack of arts appreciation, not only in people, but also in its leaders, contribute to things like socialist realism and its fellow travelers in the Third Reich and the current day culture wars of the USA? Could this be part of an overall rejection of principles broadly defined by the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment?
Well, there's quite a lot kind of written in art history since Avant-Garde and Kitsch is written by Clement Greenberg, who's a big supporter of American modernism and abstract expressionism. And he writes in 1939 about this idea of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are supported, and he's a former communist who becomes very anti-communist. And he's writing about how they're both supporting this form of kitsch. So it's not even proper art, he claims. It's a form of art to that you can serve up to people that don't understand art. It doesn't encourage them to think more broadly, to engage their brains, and to actually you know, get to understand art on its own terms. And this is something that's been very influential throughout the second half of the 20th century in art history, and still is today, in terms of how people look at the art from that period, and the art being produced in Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. And obviously it's very hard to look at the art, particularly the art produced in Nazi Germany, because it's very invested with these sort of racial, you know, these very extreme racial politics or racial ideas, and a certain amount, you know, the Soviet art is very invested with different sorts of ideas, that they had different ideology.
But would you say about Soviet art that it is really all, that all socialist realism is clear-cut propaganda, or should we differentiate there a little bit, especially given the thaw period under Khrushchev and the relative liberalization of the art world?
I think the thing you have to think about is, what is propaganda, and has propaganda, so propaganda didn't used to be such a bad word. It certainly wasn't, you know, in the first half of the 20th century, and even during the war period, you know, people, even the Americans, were keen to produce propaganda because they wanted propaganda, you know, to serve the war effort. And then it becomes this very negative term in the West, but in the Soviet Union, because everything you meant to do is meant to be working towards this perfect communist future. Yes, they were producing propaganda, and that was the aim. It was meant to be encouraging people. It was meant to be teaching people. It was meant to be didactic. It was meant to be propaganda. So, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other things. So, for instance, the Americans were really struggled with the fact that they felt a certain amount of inferiority to the Soviets about the quality of the technical quality of a lot of the socialist realism being produced. And when you look at the minutes from the meeting with the sort of art administrators who choose the art to be in the American National Exhibition, they're saying we have to produce art that's of a really high technical standard, because the Soviets are used to seeing art of really high technical standard in terms of the realism. And we have to show that Americans can do that, as well as offering these other things, as well as offering opportunities to create different forms of art and create free art. Right. So, you know, there's again, these nuances.
Interesting, yeah. I have two other questions by Henry Klein, which I think we maybe can combine. The first is, in Czechoslovakia, non-objective art in the communist era seemed politically safe. Can you comment on that? And the other question is, Kulhanek commented in 1990 that before the fall of communist art, before the fall of communism, art was easy but dangerous. Afterward, it was hard but not very dangerous. And can you comment on that as well?
Oh, okay. If I remember all that. So the first one is about Czechoslovakia. I mean, so throughout Czechoslovakia is like other countries in the Soviet sphere, that they all kind of, you know, the Kremlin was certainly encouraging people to impose the same art, to impose socialist realism in their countries. And there is a lot of pressure to produce this art in Czechoslovakia in the 1950s. So there's not that much being produced outside of that. People are producing art, which can be said for the Soviet Union as well. They can produce art privately, although they can't really advertise they're doing it, but they don't have the opportunities to show art. So often it's not about artistic production, it's about, if you don't create this certain form of art, you can't show it, so you can't make money out of it, you can't get access to the materials to produce it. And with the Soviet Union, if you're found making it as well, you'd be in a huge amount of trouble, whereas you maybe wouldn't be in so much trouble in Czechoslovakia. You'd be highly suspicious, but there just wasn't the opportunity to see this art. You couldn't show it.
Right.
And then in the 60s, there's quite a lot of, this liberal period up to the Prague Spring, so a lot of more abstract or experimental art is produced, and then there's quite a shutdown again in the 1970s during the normalization in the 80s. So you see it very much this wave of, repression on the art.
Yeah.
And what was the second question?
The second one was this remark by Kulhanek that before the fall of communism, art was easy but dangerous, and afterward it was hard but not very dangerous. I'm not sure dangerous or not dangerous to whom, but...
Yeah, well, it depends, easy, I mean, yeah, I mean, art was, all I'd say to that, because it depends on exactly your perspective and what sort of art you're referring to, but all art could be really dangerous at this time, depending. It was a lot of people who had a lot of power, and they saw the power of art, and if you were producing the sort of art that wasn't supported, and I'm talking just as much in the Soviet Union as during the McCarthy period. I mean, if you were producing certain forms of art, if you were producing more social realist art, or you were talking about the power of art to kind of, raise the morale of people or support society, that made you highly suspicious, and you could, then be accused of being a communist, you could lose your job, you could be blacklisted. So yeah, it could be very dangerous on both sides.
Right. The next question is by Michelle Willens. What was happening in German art post-war? So I guess post-war means post-Second World War. And,
well, yes, because Germany is divided. I mean, in East Germany, there's art that's more similar to socialist realism, but then there's again artists pushing back against that, whereas in West Germany it's much more aligned with kind of Western modernism, but then you have very interesting artists like Gerhard Richter, who's very interesting, one of the most celebrated and expensive artists of the current period, and he grew up in East Germany. He's trained as a socialist realist artist, and he produces this sort of art when he's at art school. And then he defects to West Germany, but uses some of the training he's learned from social realism to produce the art. So he's producing these sort of photorealist works, and calls this, with some of his friends, calls this form of art capitalist realism.
right.
So, really, really interesting. There's so much to be said about German art, and I'm not so much a specialist in that.
Sure, yeah. And I think Richter was not very happy to be reminded of his socialist realist artwork when he was still living in the GR, right?
Yes, yeah. I think they uncovered one of his former works recently, not long ago, and he wasn't very happy about that. Some mural he'd painted celebrating the socialist cause, but that's the way you made money, or you've got to produce art at that time.
Yeah. So looking at the time, we are unfortunately not able to go through all the questions, but I want to conclude with a very interesting one by Monroe Price. Would you consider that now the emphasis is using art to shape domestic attitudes or race, for example, rather than as focus on soft power? Yeah,
I mean, so once again, the access to who can display art and the sort of art that's talked about, what receives institutional support, that is very related to what has political support as well, particularly if you're talking about the big museums. But you've got to think about, funding. So many museums now reliant on private funding or coming from different foundations, and that relates. So as much as in liberal democratic countries we think, all art can be talked about, there's still taboo art. I mean, it might be art that I wouldn't personally support because of some of the ideologies and the politics behind it. But there are forms of art that can't be shown and can't be talked about and are dismissed as being bad because of their politics rather than necessarily because of the quality of the work. Yeah, there's some really interesting examples, particularly, for example, some of the works that are being produced in celebration of President Trump have been really discussed about how they almost look like socialist realism, some of these works, and there's a lot of discussion about that, but they won't be receiving the sort of institutional support because the institutions are generally more kind of, you know, democratic in the US.
Right. Julia, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot and it was really enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right. So next week, instead of our normal Cold War Spaces interviews, we are resuming an older program, the Wende series Art Past Present, which is a series of interviews with contemporary artists who talk about the significance of history and memory in their work. We start next week, and once a month on Wednesday we have an Art Past Present program. It's co-hosted by the artist Vera Karapetian, and our first guest will be the artist, writer and former scientist Enrique Martinez Zelaya. And in 2 weeks from now, Cold War Spaces will resume with guest speaker Daniel Immerwar, who is a historian at Northwestern University, Chicago, and author of How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. We will speak about colonial space beyond the logo map. I hope to see you both next week and in 2 weeks from now. Thank you very much and goodbye.